And I'm going to start in three, two, one. Hi, and welcome to a special edition podcast. I'm your host, Barrington Miller. And today we're talking about ESG. I'm representing Grove Corporate Services as its president, and today I'm joined by Seth Foreman, president of ESG at Social Suite. Welcome to the show, Seth.
Thanks for having me, Barrington. Really excited to be here and have a fun session talking about ESG.
So Seth and I go back, but today we're going to approach this topic on ESG. For those who don't know, what is it? What does it stand for? And why are we talking about it?
Yeah, it's a good place to start, Barrington. So ESG stands for environment, social, and governance, ESG. And essentially, where ESG has been around for a number of years now, and the whole concept of ESG is related to helping investors, particularly in institutional investors, understand and assess the risks associated with mainly public companies. So when you think about the environment, these are factors related to emissions, water usage, different waste and pollution. Social metrics are related to things like diversity and equality, and governance metrics, things like different policies like anti-corruption policies, anti-slavery policies, and ultimately the transparency that public companies are having as it related to all across ESG itself.
Where does it come from, ESG, and where is it going?
So where does it come from? You know, when you think about ESG, a lot of when you go back and you look at society and society factors, climate change, there's a lot of macro changes going on in the world right now that's been driven around climate. And with those changes happening, society has been really demanding and pushing companies and investors to do more, to have more action, to create this change and this movement. And really, when you look at institutional investors, the likes of BlackRock as an example, they're also looking and evaluating companies to understand what is the risk associated with certain ESG-driven factors, environmental factors, to help them assess the risk of a company. And you know, historically, institutional investors are looking at financial metrics and financial disclosures, but really the movement of ESG is also having public companies be more transparent about their non-financial disclosures related to ESG to help those institutional investors weigh and evaluate financial disclosures, non-financial disclosures, to have a more holistic view as to whether they're going to invest into a company. And so all of this has driven ESG, and why today I've been reading anywhere from 10 to almost $20 trillion of ESG capital in the world today that is being driven by many of these institutional investors. So it is a big deal, and it's why companies need to be paying attention to it. Where is it going? The expectation is, given climate change continues to be such a big factor and institutional investors are continuing to look at ESG as a risk assessment tool, ESG will only continue to become more and more important, and why companies all the way down to large caps, small caps, micro caps should be paying attention to this. And one thing I'll add, Barrington, is that there's about 95% of Fortune 500 companies today are reporting on ESG metrics. That adoption rate lowers as you go into more mid-cap, small cap, and micro cap. But what we're seeing at Social Suite is more and more companies across the board are getting started with that ESG disclosure process.
And you mentioned your company, Social Suite. Let's talk a little bit about what Social Suite is and what they do.
Yeah, so Social Suite, we're a venture-backed ESG technology company. And so what we do, we specialize in working with small cap, micro cap companies and helping them get started on their ESG journey, providing a platform and support with tracking capabilities, reporting capabilities, all really catered to companies that don't have chief sustainability officers, don't have ESG leads, don't have a multi-million-dollar ESG budget, but are being asked to get started on really want to start reporting on their ESG credentials. So we are really specialized in helping those companies go through those phases and ultimately to help them track and measure their ESG credentials.
And what are the market dynamics and influences that are happening with ESG?
Yeah, there are many. I think to start out with, you have dynamics related to investors. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a significant amount of ESG-driven capital in the market, trillions and trillions of dollars. So the influence is there that there are many institutional investors that will conduct an analysis of companies based on their ESG credentials. They're going to look at, perhaps they're looking at ESG ratings, or they're going to do their own analysis based on the ESG information that company is disclosing. And part of that analysis will either decide whether they're going to invest into that company or not. So one of the main influences is related to the investor side, and many companies from a capital raising standpoint or to expand the amount of investors that they work with will start to report on ESG. And so for a microcap company that's looking to raise capital, it's important that you're starting to look at and consider starting that ESG journey if you haven't yet for investors. So that's one channel that we see that's really important. Then you have customers. We're starting to see large cap companies, multinational companies, some of the Fortune 100 companies in the world, where they're starting to pull together expectations around having their entire supply chain, upstream and downstream, report on ESG. So they're providing emissions information, things related to their social metrics. So if you're even down to a microcap company, if you are expecting or in the process of selling your product up into a larger customer, you may be asked to provide this information. So that's a major influence that's coming on. That's fairly new, probably in the last 1 to 2 years, and every year we're going to see more and more big companies request this information. We're also seeing compliance start to be an important factor here. The SEC in the US is potentially going to pass a climate disclosure ruling next month in April. We shall see. It's been delayed a couple times, but there is an expectation it may pass this time. And part of that is going to have different metrics related to climate disclosures. And then with the Canadian Securities Administrator, there's proposals in place also related to climate disclosures that companies may have to start to disclose starting in 2024. Again, that's a proposal stage. We're going to see what happens. And so compliance is a big factor. And then the final part is people. Every company employs many employees, and what we see, particularly with younger employees, there is a real demand and expectation that younger employees are having about companies that they work for, that they have ESG and sustainability transparency, information that really for younger people are looking for companies to do more related to the environment and climate change. And so from a retainment and from a recruitment standpoint, we see a lot of companies starting to go on that ESG and sustainability journey for their employees. So that's another influence and factor that we're seeing happen right now.
So it's safe to say that this isn't just a passing fad or trend. If you're a company, if there's two companies and they're both equal in every aspect, one has an ESG program or reporting program and the other one doesn't, that one with the program will more likely be able to raise those funds and have people invest in it. Is that
Yes,
safe to say?
yes, 100% Barrington, and that's actually a question that we frequently will ask investors. And I think that what we see with investors when they're evaluating companies, the companies that have ESG credentials, from an investor standpoint, they're going to look at that and look at that company as being more proactive, being more really thoughtful around the risks that they're associated that they're and how they're managing risks as a company. There's a trust factor as well. So all of that, when they're evaluating company holistically, are part of what they're weighing as to whether they're going to invest into that company. So the companies that have that information, the ESG information, in many ways, it's a net positive and quite opportunistic for those companies to start ESG reporting.
And again, you've dovetailed nicely into the next question. This seems like a daunting task, very, very heavy. It's this mountain. I'm a company. I'm just getting started. It can be complex. It can be time consuming. For small and mid cap companies, what are the best practices to get started on your ESG journey?
Yeah, it's a good question, Barrington. And in many ways, that's how Social Suite got started. We looked at different markets, and when we were doing our research, particularly for small cap and micro cap companies, we found that a lot of them were looking for a way to a platform and a solution that could help them and guide them through that process, because ESG can be complex. There's a lot of frameworks. It can be overwhelming for some companies, and particularly at the size of company that we're all dealing with, there's no chief sustainability officers, and there's limited resources and budgets in general. So what we recommend for companies that are just getting started, one thing is that for many of the companies we work with are public companies, and you already have a number of different disclosures. And almost as a misconception, public companies in many ways are sometimes 20-30% of the way there in terms of ESG disclosures. It's just that all of that information is scattered everywhere. It's in their 10Ks, it's in their employee handbooks, it's all over the place, and there hasn't really been an effort to compile it all together. And so a really good place to get started is to start looking at a lot of those disclosures you already have and to compile it. And ideally, it's going to be based on one of the different ESG frameworks that are out there. We generally will recommend to our customers to start with the World Economic Forum Stakeholder Capitalism Framework, which is a framework that we recommend as a starting point because it's quite simple. It's 21 metrics. It's across people, planet, prosperity, and governance factors. And it's really just a simplified list, almost like a checklist of all the different ESG factors to start with. And that's where looking at disclosures you already have and measuring and compiling them together is a really good place to start. And then you can then have that baseline of where you stand today to then think about where you're going to progress from there as a good starting point.
And I'm sort of just going to spin off with this next question, and it's related to the overwhelming amount of information that's available to these companies. You're not the only ESG reporting service that's out there. I guess, what is Social Suite's differentiator? How can a company know? I mean, you had a background in it and an established track record. But for somebody who doesn't know, what is Social Suite's differentiator when it comes to companies choosing a program like yourself?
I appreciate that question, Barrington. I think for us, part of it goes back to our roots as a company. So Social Suite started about 5 years ago. And actually, we started as a impact reporting software for nonprofits. So we still have the business today. We work with the likes of Habitat for Humanity, a lot of big nonprofits that came to us to help them with impact reporting and helping them continue to raise money through their fundraisers. Now, why that's important is because as we built our business, we were able to really understand what it takes to work with companies with limited resources, limited budgets, to ultimately report on the impact that they're having with the world. And so when it comes to ESG and the surge of ESG, where we were able to develop our program, our software, and our expertise, is working with companies like small caps, micro caps, that ESG is not their full-time job, but they still need a way to keep it simple, to help them only report on the right metrics and do so in a way that's cost effective. There's a lot of options out there that are incredibly expensive. But from what we've seen for the companies that we generally work with, and we have today 100 public companies that we work with across 6 major exchanges, and all of them are right around that similar size of micro, small, mid cap, but looking for a solution that can guide them through that process to report. So I think that ultimately our differentiators come down to being providing really good support, a really easy to use platform and technology, and ultimately having an expertise of working with the types of customers that are in the size that we work with microcap and small caps.
So you mentioned that next month the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, is making, or hopefully, fingers crossed, making a climate disclosure ruling. Are the companies right now required to report on ESG?
So right now, ESG is a voluntary disclosure. Companies are doing it because they're getting, for a variety of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's institutional investors that are asking for it, whether it's their customers, whether it's their employees. But the expectation is that globally, so in Europe right now, there are certain levels of requirements in certain regions across Europe. And it's a phased approach. Larger companies are going to have to start reporting this year. And as you get into the subsequent years, more and more companies will have to report on ESG. And then in the US, we'll see with the SEC ruling and what it looks like. The expectation, if it does pass, is that companies will have to, at minimum, report on their Scope 1 emissions, Scope 2 emissions, potentially Scope 3. That's still up in the air as to whether Scope 3 will be part of the SEC ruling. And then there's going to be a number of other risk-related questions aligned with the TCFD framework. They're going to have companies have to explain what their plan is to reduce emissions and how they're dealing with climate change in general, that are all going to be part of it. But again, we won't know for sure of exactly what's in it until it's finalized. And that could happen over the next few weeks.
How does ESG affect the bottom line for these companies?
I think in many ways, from an investor standpoint, we see a lot of companies that have been able to successfully raise money. There's one company that we work with that's a microcap exploration mining company that's in the battery mineral business. And we work with them within about a 3 to 6 month period. We help them produce their baseline report, help them produce a plan around how they're going to pull together their ESG credentials. And they were able to raise upwards of $15 million from an ESG driven Canadian investment fund. Now that's dollars that they would not have been able to achieve if they didn't have the ESG report. And so that's an example of bottom line benefits to a company. Beyond that, we have examples of our own customers that have been able to achieve and win offtake agreements with major automobile manufacturers that they likely would not have been able to achieve without the ESG report. And then you also have the employee side where, from a motivational standpoint, morale, We have one of our small cap companies that are customers of ours. The main reason why they did ESG reporting was actually for their employees. That was the primary reason. And they put a lot of effort to produce a full report. And the first thing they did was actually do an all hands meeting to all of their employees to go through the report. And ultimately, what that's doing is creating transparency, trust of their employees, and really helping the employees understand, the company's response to climate change, the response to social issues, and ultimately raising morale across the company. So I think from a bottom line standpoint, there's a lot of benefits to this, but it really depends on which channel is most important, or maybe all of them.
So we're gonna take what you said, because there's always two sides to every single story. Um, like I'm looking at the mining sector. The mining sector has been practicing and doing ESG for decades, decades and decades, although it wasn't labeled or termed ESG. Um, Now it is, and I guess from some of their points of view, it's they're a little bit annoyed because they've already been doing this, and now there's this reporting that is coming into effect. Um, I guess what's your point of view for the companies that have already been doing this as sort of like a best practices, and where we're going right now?
Yeah, I think the ones that have been doing this for a while, and many have. I think particularly in the mining and mineral sectors and energy sectors, they've been asked in many ways. It's been required for them to do certain aspects of ESG for a number of years by a variety of reasons. But I think for them, there's a lot of, let's say, muscle memory education that they have already have in the company that gives them an advantage to continue to progress. I think one thing that we talk a lot about at Social Suite is that ESG is a journey. It can't be something where, I shouldn't say it can't be, but it's really difficult for a company out of the gate to get everybody in the organization, particularly the executive team, the board, educated on what ESG is, what needs to happen, and get it done within a couple months. There's a lot to it, and that's why it's important for companies to take it in steps, take it in phases, look at it as a multi-year effort, particularly for the size of companies that, for micro caps, small caps that are looking to start this process. The expectation should be that this is going to take time, and you have to phase it out and really focus on doing it as simple as possible. For the companies that have been doing this for a while, it's great. They have a head start on it, and they're able to, as regulatory environment changes, as requirements change in general, they'll be able to adopt faster. So they have a real advantage on that side.
Who's I guess Europe is further ahead when it comes to ESG reporting. Are they, or maybe not? But then why is
Yeah.
that? Or is everybody sort of rising up at the same level at the same time?
Yeah, Europe has been on certainly the leaders globally around driving change related to ESG. I think there's a number of factors around it, but I think from a society standpoint in Europe, uh, the people across Europe have been really wanting to see more change driven, both on the investor side and on the corporate side. And so they've been driving this, and that drive has pushed investors, the governments across Europe to demand this and expect it. And out of Europe, you have sovereign wealth funds, institutional European investors that require it across all of their portfolio companies. And because of that, that influence is driving companies across the world to start and report on different ESG criteria. And that includes not only corporates, but we're seeing it across asset managers, hedge funds, private equity company firms, venture capital firms across the board, where Europe's been driving this and will continue to, but now we're seeing nations around the world really get going with the US, with Canada, Australia. We're starting to see to the point of even fines coming to play for companies making misleading statements related to ESG that we may talk about. But it's really it's a real movement right now that we're seeing globally across the world.
What are some of the challenges and misconceptions that CEOs associate with ESG reporting?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot. I think it could start with that, as we mentioned earlier, the complexity, and this is so overwhelming, this is so complex, and this is so expensive that I'm just not going to do it. And I'm going to kick the can down the road, and I'm just going to wait. And I think that that's something where it's really, really important for companies to, at minimum, start to educate their teams and understand it so that they can start preparing to start that process. And so there's a lot of things, you can be doing, such as at least looking at all the disclosures you already have that's related to ESG. One part of the process that we recommend is a materiality assessment, which is essentially surveying a variety of stakeholders, your board, your executive teams, your customers, your employees, different cohorts of people associated across your organization, your different stakeholders, and asking them really simple topic questions about ESG. What are those? What are the main material impact related to environmental factors, social factors, governance factors? And you could pull together this survey data to help an organization directionally understand what are those core material topics around ESG that you should be focusing on as an organization. It's a really good place to start to simplify that effort around ESG. So it's really, those misconceptions sometimes can be related to the complexity, and there's ways to do it in a simple process. I think another one that we find that companies sometimes struggle with is that the getting the board and the executive team on board to start doing ESG, and where we see companies sometimes get bogged down is when ESG is tasked to someone in the company, and the board and the executive team hasn't fully grasped it yet. And so it's really important to overcome that, so that to ensure that the CEO, the board, everybody's on board to start, and that drives the company through the ESG process. So that's another area that's really important that companies are all aligned towards doing before they start.
We are going to move now to some rainbow colors, specifically green and blue. What is greenwashing, and how do companies avoid it?
Yeah. So greenwashing is essentially the concept of a company making an environmental-based disclosure and ultimately committing to it. But what will happen is that companies will make some sort of commitment, but then they don't follow through, and they don't actually do it. And so what that creates is a misleading statement, potentially from an investor side to investors, or it could be misleading for a company. And so greenwashing comes into play when you're making certain types of misleading statements, and we're seeing certain regulators starting to find companies and investors based on these certain statements that they're making. For example, out of Australia, ASIC, which is a regulatory body, there's been a number of fines that they've issued related to certain misleading statements around greenwashing. And so it's really important for companies that if you're going to make certain climate related disclosures, that you make the commitment, you explain and describe what you're doing, and you actually do it. The ones that just make a statement and they don't do it are the ones that potentially could be looked at as greenwashing, and that's not good for anybody.
No, no, it isn't. And blue washing incorporates greenwashing, but in addition to environmental claims, it also includes societal and governance claims. But keep in mind, and this is more for the audience and the viewers, there are times that it could be done unintentionally. Like you did go in with the hopes of either pursuing this report, pursuing this program, and maybe funding fell through, or there was a change in management or something along the way. So it's a buyer beware, and make sure again, always do your homework, do your research, because it might still be a good company and they just hit a speed bump. Um, but there are a number of companies that will, and it's not only with ESG. You see that in multiple hot sectors, companies making claims. Um, what do you expect to happen in the world of ESG over the next 18 to 24 months?
Yeah, I think in general, the expectation is that ESG will continue to grow. I think that there's continuing to see more inflows of investment, and ultimately that will increase the amount of ESG driven dollars that are out there. We expect to see more and more companies uh, start to adopt and start their ESG journey to report on ESG. So I think that's on the pro side. We're going to continue to see that. But I think that ESG in general, particularly in the US market, and this is important to discuss here as well, is that it can be quite a divisive topic in the US and in the US politics. We're starting to see a lot of different viewpoints on ESG on both sides of the aisle. And so it certainly is front and center, but there's a lot of viewpoints on what it is. And I think what's important to note is that ESG is very new. It's a new concept. And it's something that, because it's so new, there's a lot of viewpoints on what it is. There's a lot of misconceptions of what it is. And because of those misconceptions, it gets confused to a lot. It creates a lot of confusion amongst people and even politicians. But when you take a step back and you zoom out and you look at what's happening in the world, climate change is going to continue to happen. It's going to continue to be a top of mind item for people around the world. And ultimately, it's really about impact and companies and their employees and society and consumers really pushing companies to do more. And that's where, and investors asking companies to do more. And that's where you're seeing companies really start to, at minimum, being more transparent and looking at a way that they can report, track on these different metrics so that they can ultimately show that they're looking to do something and report on this information.
I'm going to get a little homegrown here. The Canadian Securities Administrators' current proposals on climate-related disclosures. Is it safe to say that we're going to follow the SEC-ish? Just because that's the easiest and safest thing to do.
Yeah, it's in proposal stage. The CSA has it in proposal stage. It was back in 2021. It's still in a proposal stage. My understanding is that they're looking to see what comes out of the SEC next month. So we'll see, and perhaps aligning what the CSA does related to the SEC. I think there's also there's the ISSB, which is an organization that's also trying to pull together an international response around frameworks. So with a new ISSB framework, that also is expected to be finalized over the summer, perhaps even June. So the CSA is also trying to see what happens with the ISSB so they can then align on the Canadian side with that framework as well. So there's a lot of, this year, 2023 is a pivotal year around ESG and particularly around frameworks, given that there's just a lot of consolidation happening, both regulatory and with a lot of the different framework organizations that try to make it simpler so that globally there can be better standards and definitions and alignment around what ESG should be. And so that companies don't have to report on 15 different frameworks. They can just report on maybe one or two, and it can be a bit more seamless. And that also helps the investor, the investment community, so that instead of looking at 10 different companies and you get 10 different frameworks, there can be, and 10 different types of metrics, it can be just one. And that's where the industry is trying to go, so that everybody wins around what companies' response is to ESG.
You just spurred another question as we're winding down. I have a company and I'm operating in two different jurisdictions that may have two different ESG reporting metric standards, or one may have it and the other one doesn't. But it's under the same umbrella of company XYZ. How would that ESG reporting work? Do I just go to the place that has the most and use that as the current, or would I have to make two different ones?
Yeah, I think that it's generally what we recommend from a framework perspective is it really depends on what audience you're catering towards. So going back to the influences around ESG, we generally will find that if you're really trying to influence an investor audience in North America, SASB, which will soon be ISSB, is a framework that a lot of investors will be using. And so that could be a way that you could combine the frameworks together with the two companies.
Sorry, I'm just jumping in and interrupting. What does SASB stand for, just for our audience?
Yeah, so SASB is essentially it's a framework that's really designed to help investors assess the risk of different companies with a varying degree of different types of questions that corporations need to answer that is aligned with different verticals. So there may be a vertical around software, and there's a SASB designated software vertical with software generated questions related to risk. And then there's there's a SASB vertical for manufacturing, and there's a number of them based on verticals. And so it's really a framework geared for investors. Whereas there's other frameworks, let's say the World Economic Forum Stakeholder Capitalism Framework, that is built to simplify the ESG process with questions that are more catering towards an audience of employees or potentially for customers. So it's a little bit more of a descriptive natured framework that's easy to understand, whereas SASB is a bit more specifically for an investment community, so they can evaluate a number of companies together, all answering the same risk-based questions.
Well, Seth, I know we're approaching our time. On behalf of Grove, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to inform us and let us know the updates on ESG. And our audience, if you have questions, please reach out to Social Suite. Seth, how do they get a hold of you, and how do they get a hold of Social Suite to pursue this?
Absolutely. So, well, one is you could always visit our website. It's socialsuitehq.com, or you can email me directly, and my email is seth@socialsuitehq.com. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about ESG. We also have a newsletter that you're welcome to sign up for to learn more about ESG in general that we send out on a weekly basis. And would love to hear from anybody in the audience that has any questions.
Well, thank you for that. And for our audience, if you like this content and want to hear more, please make sure you let us know. And click like, subscribe, follow, all of those good things. I've been your host, Barrington Miller, and this has been a special edition on ESG coming to you from Grove. Thank you.
Thanks, Barrington. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
No problem. We are going to stay on Seth.
Stay on for a couple seconds. I'm going to end recording here.